the lost Platonic doctrine of icebergs and the trivializing of evil today. Many of us are familiar with the Platonic doctrine of ideas. We might not understand it, but we've heard of it. How many of us, however, have ever heard of Plato's doctrine of icebergs? In order to understand the significance, the importance of the doctrine of icebergs for our age, it is helpful to return to the Gospel according to Matthew. In Matthew 8, we read of an incident in which Jesus confronts two men possessed by demons, demonic forces. And these two men are visibly violent, extremely violent, so much so that everyone avoids them. Everyone in town avoids them, walks away from them. Jesus comes up to them, however, and these demons who are possessing these violent, visibly violent men, beg Jesus, not to torture them. They ask Jesus to cast them into swine that are visibly in the neighborhood, in the neck of the woods. So what happens? Jesus forces these demons away out of these two men, and the demons rush into the bunch of swine who are around there, and the swine at once race into a pond, a lake, and drown. So they go under water. They die. Now, people in town, some people see this or witness to this, and they rush to the center of town and tell everyone, including the two who had been possessed, what happened. And at that point, everyone goes up to Jesus and tells him to get the heck out of there. Leave the region altogether. I say, why? Well, on a silly reading, of course, they might have been offended because of Jesus' behavior. Jesus, after all, provoked the death of swine. That is, of course, very silly reading. On a serious reading, what we have here is Jesus, the living truth, that faces the demons, faces the evil that is manifest, violently manifest in these two fellows. And faced with Jesus, evil responds. It says, well, you're going to torture me here. I can't stand it. Let me rush into the swine. Why the swine? Well, the swine are people who live in the element of compulsion rather than of reflection. They have reflexes, mechanical reflexes, we might say. They respond to the environment without thinking, without reflecting. So they rush into these swine. Now, the swine herders are not disturbed by that. What they're disturbed by is the sight of these pigs that go drown themselves. What is the significance of this drowning, this entering into death, the waters of death? Well, if we read this seriously, then we see that the swine are people who are just as the ordinary folks of the town. They're worried that that's going to be their own fate. They have a problem with that because evil that is manifest in a couple of crazy people is something they can bear. They just walk around it. They know it's there. They identify it. They see it. It's not a big deal. They can live with that. What they can't live with is the exposure of an evil that is hidden. So the evil that is within the ordinary swine, that has to be concealed, cannot be faced with truth. Truth cannot come up to it and expose that. That has to remain concealed as far as these people are concerned. By and large, a polity needs to conceal its evils. Otherwise, it would be faced with collective suicide. Now, what does this tell us about the human condition? For one thing, that you're not going to get rid of evil. You can address one visible evil, another visible evil, but you won't be seriously addressing evil at its core, the hidden evil, which is the worst evil, of course. As bad as the visible evil is as a manifestation, it remains but a tip of an iceberg. And here we get to Plato's Doctrine of Icebergs. Now, on Plato's account, as we are told by reliable sources, on Plato's account, reality is essentially constituted of icebergs. Now, these icebergs float above the waters of death and are thereby made visible. But what floats is only a tip. And that tip is everything that we can grasp, the tangible world, the world of bodies. Now, the bulk of the iceberg, however, remains unseen. You cannot grasp it. Now, that aspect of the iceberg is the spiritual aspect, the part that is thought of. We can think that, we can return to it in the element of reflection, whereas the top, the tip, is seen and grasped and is physical in the vulgar pedestrian sense of the term, physical as in bodies. The bulk of the iceberg remains unseen, out of reach, and thus it is hard to address it. And certainly it can only be addressed, only in the element of reflection. Now, that means without compulsion. However, insofar as we are visible and we identify ourselves with something visible, graspable, as we, shall we say, we are mind that we are the iceberg. Reality constitutes us, right? So, insofar as we are apparent and we identify with what is visible, we have a very hard time being free from the physical and the visible. And so we remain compelled. We live in the element of compulsion. Now, when that happens, we are easily affected by external evils, and we tend to identify evil as something visible. We tend to ignore evil that is invisible. And of course, this brings us back to the Gospels story. Now, what this further suggests is that given the propensity of men who have somehow fallen upward into this visibility, the tendency of men that have thus fallen to rely on what is visible and thus be compelled by visible evidence, most men are quite unlikely to live in the element of reflection and thus to attend to the bulk of the iceberg, the spiritual reality that constitutes the bulk of reality as a whole. Now, one might ask, are these two elements completely disconnected? The outer, the physical, the spiritual, the noetic, the intelligible. Well, Plato's response, as everyone who knows the doctrine of ideas will surely recognize, Plato's response is that to assume that there is a disconnection, radical disconnection between the two, is to be a materialist. Why is that? Well, let us consider Democritus. Democritus was a philosopher of nature who is known to have preached, to have taught, that reality is constituted fundamentally of atoms in the void. Now, the atomos, that which cannot be separated, is evidently without space, cannot be separated because it has no dimension. You say, well, it's a dot. Well, a dot that is in space, that is temporal, therefore, obviously can be separated. So it is not something in space and time. It is in the void, evidently, necessarily. So reality fundamentally is atoms and the void. What is the nature of the void? No void is a way to say mind. So reality is mind, and these atoms that are free floating in the mind are kind of thoughts, right? So we have thoughts that prop up in the mind, but there is a radical disconnection. Nothing accounts for anyway this connection or any connection between the atoms and the void. But this is materialism. Materialism, in effect, is all about radical disconnection between thoughts and mind, content and form. There's no fundamental connection between form, finality, and the end, the meaning, and the content, stuff that is inside. Now, Democritus, being an ancient materialist rather than a modern materialist, is quite earnest in his view, and thus concedes readily that the content of reality is an object of pure thought, contemplation, so, or of intellectual intuition, we might say, right, to speak with medievals. Problem is, this contemplation is cut off from, ordinary discourse. So you can have a vision, contemplative vision, of almost, this pure intuition of these atoms. So there are moments, right, in the void. They're there, they're silent, they don't speak, they're not connected to the mind in a meaningful way. They're just there and we contemplate them. There's no battling with them, there's no arguing. Arguing remains within the realm of foolish men. Foolish men remain focused on the tip of the iceberg. They look at these atoms, as it were, without considering their proper context, which is the mind, the void. So the ancient materialists will dismiss everything that we see ordinarily as being, as obscuring its original context, which is the void. So they will invite us to consider the contents of experience in the context of the mind. However, this mind, and here's a problem, this mind is utterly indifferent to the contents of the mind, of its own content, to its own contents. Now, in comes Plato, Socrates, and they say, well, no. There is a logical connection between the two. So there is a dialogue between the two, content and form. what are we to make of this today? Well, in our age, we are used to focusing on what is visible, the tip of the iceberg. And to see that in the context not of a pure void mind, anima mundi, one might say, to speak in Latin, the soul of the world, but to see it in the context of an unfolding. Now, this unfolding, which we call usually evolution, is an unfolding of the tips of the iceberg. You say, well, the notion that all there is tips of the iceberg that are unfolding into some perhaps new reality, or something that is, at any rate, grounded in the tips of the iceberg, is a notion that, on the one hand, blinds us and is based on a blinding to the bulk of the iceberg, but is a notion that involves serious difficulties for man. Well, for one thing, we tend to have this confidence that problems can be solved once you eradicate or erase a tip of the iceberg. Now, it just so happens that another tip of the iceberg comes up. And we say, well, if we make more of an effort, we bring in more machines, more technology, we can get rid of all tips of the iceberg, so to speak. And then we don't have any more problems. Or we have secured all the tips of the iceberg in a problem-free world, which is the technological world. So now we have all the tips of the icebergs gathered together into a system. This system is the new reality. Now, we seldom wonder why, once we've gotten rid of one tip of the iceberg, another one comes up. Of course, if we were to return to Plato's Doctrine of Icebergs, we would easily recognize that once you have driven one tip of the iceberg below the surface of visibility, what is tangible, well, the iceberg will be shifting. And as it shifts, another bit of the iceberg will come up. So you get rid of that one, then by doing so, you're simply shifting the iceberg, so another part of the iceberg will come up. Right? So when you solve, so to speak, one problem, one visible problem, another one comes up. In fact, it's just another manifestation of the iceberg. And this is what technical man, what modern man tends to do. He tends to identify problems, in fact, evils, with one thing or another that is visible. And when he does so, he tries to get rid of that identified evil. When he does so, here comes another one. And this is all based on this blindness of modern man to what is beneath visibility. The metaphysical, one might say. There's no such thing. We're only looking at the surface, above the waters of death.